At its peak, HTC was worth more than $35 billion. It made the first Android phone ever sold. It built devices that reviewers called the best smartphones on the planet. And then, within roughly a decade, it sold the majority of its phone business to Google for just $1.1 billion, a fraction of what the company had once been worth. The question worth asking is not simply what went wrong. The more precise question is, why did a company that helped invent the modern smartphone era end up with almost nothing to show for it? HTC began not as a phone brand, but as a contract manufacturer. Founded in Taiwan in 1997 by Cher Wang, Ht Chou, and Peter Chou, the company's original business was making devices for other people's labels. In the early 2000s, that meant building Windows mobile handhelds and communicators for carriers and technology companies who wanted the hardware without the manufacturing complexity. HTC was invisible to consumers by design. The skill it was building, though, tight integration of hardware engineering and software customization, would matter enormously once the smartphone market accelerated. The breakthrough came from two directions almost simultaneously. Microsoft's Windows mobile platform gave HTC a software ecosystem to build around, and a growing network of global carriers gave it distribution. HTC wasn't selling to consumers in shops. It was selling to operators who bundled devices into contracts. That model worked because carriers in Europe, North America, and Asia were hungry for differentiated hardware they could brand themselves. HTC supplied the engineering, the carriers supplied the customers. For several years, both sides were satisfied. Then, in 2007, Apple released the iPhone, and in 2008, HTC shipped the HTC Dream, the first commercially available Android handset. For a brief, remarkable moment, HTC was positioned at the exact center of the industry's transformation. It had the manufacturing expertise, the carrier relationships, and now a partnership with Google's open-source platform that gave it genuine software leverage. Revenue climbed. The company launched its own brand, rather than hiding inside carrier labels. By 2011, HTC was the best-selling smartphone brand in the United States. Its flagship devices, the HTC One series in particular, earned some of the strongest reviews in the industry. The HTC One M7, released in 2013, was widely described by Technology Press as the best-designed Android phone available at the time. Revenues peaked around 2011, when HTC reported figures in the range of $465 billion, approximately $15 billion US, making it briefly one of the most valuable technology companies in Asia. That was the summit. What almost no one outside the company fully appreciated at the time was how fragile the structure underneath that summit actually was. The hidden crack was a product strategy that produced too many devices with too little differentiation between them. Where Apple released one flagship per year and Samsung was consolidating around a clear Galaxy hierarchy, HTC was flooding the market with dozens of models. Carriers could choose from an overwhelming number of HTC handsets, but that breadth diluted the brand rather than strengthening it. Consumers had difficulty identifying what an HTC phone stood for. The engineering quality was often genuinely excellent. The marketing identity was not. Compounding that was a structural dependence on carrier relationships at precisely the moment consumers were beginning to care about brands independently of which operator they used. Apple had already demonstrated that a device could generate consumer demand that pulled people toward a carrier rather than the reverse. Samsung was learning the same lesson and investing heavily in global marketing to cement it. HTC was still largely operating in a carrier-driven logic that was quietly becoming obsolete. The decisions made under these pressures did not resolve the structural problem. They deepened it. HTC continued expanding its product line when consolidation was needed. Marketing spending remained modest relative to Samsung, which by 2012 and 2013 was committing billions of dollars annually to global advertising. HTC's marketing budget was a fraction of that. The company also faced a significant patent dispute with Apple beginning around 2010, which consumed legal resources and management attention during a period when the competitive window was narrowing fast. Component costs were rising as HTC tried to maintain premium hardware quality, but without the volume that Samsung commanded, it could not negotiate equivalent supplier terms. Margins compressed. And because HTC was not operating at Samsung's scale, it could not absorb that compression the way a larger manufacturer could. The unraveling was not a single event, but a compounding sequence. Market share in the United States, which had been HTC's strongest market, eroded as Samsung's Galaxy S line gained momentum and Apple's iPhone retained its premium position. HTC was caught between two rivals with structural advantages it could not match. Apple owned its software ecosystem entirely and generated fierce consumer loyalty. Samsung had manufacturing scale, component integration, and marketing firepower that dwarfed HTC's capacity. The middle ground HTC occupied, good Android hardware at premium prices, was precisely the territory Samsung was claiming with increasing aggression. By 2013 and 2014, revenue was falling sharply. The company reported losses. Efforts to relaunch with premium devices like the HTC One M8 and M9 received positive reviews but did not reverse the commercial trajectory. A brand that consumers could not clearly identify was a brand they were not choosing when alternatives were obvious. The outcome arrived in stages. HTC's smartphone market share shrank from a meaningful position in 2011 to a rounding error by the mid-2010s. In September 2017, Google announced it would acquire the majority of HTC's smartphone engineering and design talent, roughly 2,000 employees, along with a non-exclusive license to HTC's intellectual property. The transaction was valued at $1.1 billion. For a company that had once carried a market capitalization exceeding $35 billion, the arithmetic was stark. HTC retained its brand and continued to operate in diminished form, focusing on areas including virtual reality hardware through its Vive division. But the smartphone empire was functionally over. The aftermath scattered across the industry in ways worth noting. Many of the engineers Google acquired became part of its hardware effort, contributing to the Pixel phone program. HTC's patents and design heritage influenced a generation of Android hardware. The brand itself persisted, but without the consumer relevance it had held at its peak. The carriers, who had once been HTC's primary customers, had by then lost much of their power to shape consumer device preferences anyway. The structural shift HTC had failed to navigate had completed itself regardless. The lesson embedded in HTC's collapse is not that innovation is insufficient. HTC innovated consistently. The mechanism that failed was identity at scale. A company can build excellent hardware and still lose if consumers cannot form a clear picture of what that hardware represents. Samsung understood this and bought it with marketing investment. Apple had built it into the product architecture from the beginning. HTC understood engineering and carrier relationships, two things that mattered enormously in the era it came from, and progressively less in the era it was entering. When the market shifted from operator-driven distribution to consumer-driven brand choice, HTC's core competency became a liability rather than an advantage. The engineers were exceptional. The strategic pivot never came cleanly enough or early enough to change what the numbers recorded. The company that made the first Android phone watched Android become the dominant mobile platform on Earth and captured almost none of the long-term value that dominance produced.